Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Navy Memorial at the conclusion of the presentation of a new report by the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments on amphibious warfare. And joining us now is one of the principal authors of that, Bryan Clark. Bryan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Vago. I appreciate it.
You guys have obviously been studying this as part of a broader series of reports you're doing on naval power, including your fleet architecture study. You're obviously the think tank that's been named as the triumvirate of views, congressionally mandated, of course, study that's happening on fleet architecture. It's you guys, MITRE, if I'm correct, as the federally funded Research and Development Center, as well as the Navy's strategy office that's feeding into that, or the assessment office. In terms of this amphibious warfare project that you guys have developed, this sort of study, I mean, it's really, really fascinating how, you know, your guys' strategic vision for distributed operations for the Marine Corps. Why don't you tell us a little bit of some of the core both assumptions, but also some of the core recommendations you and Jesse have floated on this?
Well, the biggest driver behind the new concepts that we described is the range at which some of the enemy anti-ship missiles and surface-to-air missiles are going to be able to reach amphibious forces. So they're going to have to operate from hundreds of miles away, as opposed to what we saw in Incheon or Iwo Jima, where they're tens of miles away. So when you think about having to operate from hundreds of miles away, that drives you to have to use long-range air connectors to a greater degree, so the MV-22, and then you need fires to be able to support those Marines when they get into contact with the enemy. So things like the F-35 and then surface-to-surface missiles like Tomahawk might be necessary to actually support Marines on the ground that are hundreds of miles away from the amphibious ship that hosted them. So when we think about that kind of threat environment, we also considered, well, how would I defeat that threat environment? And are amphibious forces still necessary? Because that's what a lot of people have talked about. Well, what happens is, if I'm dealing with coastal defense cruise missiles on Keshem Island off of Iran, or if I'm dealing with what might be in the Spratly Islands that China's put there, they're going to be entrenched, dug in, and you're going to need to go root them out. So either you got to root them out with ground troops that are going to go blow them up piece by piece, like you see in World War II, or you're going to have to use those ground troops to do the targeting so that you could do airstrikes and then engage them, that way. But ground troops and amphibious forces are still going to be a necessary part of dealing with these contested environments that we're likely to see in the future. And so it led us to some recommendations with regard to increasing the number of airplanes in the amphibious ready group and in the Marine Expeditionary Unit. So instead of having our big deck amphibs carry just 6 airplanes, 6 TAC aircraft, F-35s, they're going to carry 20 is what we would recommend. And they would take the other aircraft that they would normally carry and move those onto smaller deck amphibious ships. That drives you to a 4-ship amphibious ready group rather than today's 3. So that larger amphibious ready group is able to carry that same amount of stuff, as well as the TAC air that enables the fires to support the Marines on the ground. We also recommend that Marines start buying some fires that would be able to enable a expeditionary advance base like they would set up in Palawan Island, for example, to do surface-to-surface attacks on ships that are nearby and help with the sea control problem that the Navy's facing in a place like the South China Sea. They'd be able to do air defense to be able to hold back enemy bombers that might be trying to overfly the area where the Marines are operating and trying to reach friendly forces that are behind them. So the Marines would be back to their roots of being the expeditionary force that protects a force that's behind them and operating at some distance from the enemy. We recommend the Marines look at new surface connectors to replace the current family of LCACs and landing craft utility that they have today, and buy ones that have better protection for the Marines, but then also have the ability to carry more gear, because they're probably going to need to be able to carry these air defense systems and surface-to-surface missiles.
One of the things, and to point out for our audience, that the LCAC is the landing craft air cushion, which is the high-speed hovercraft, effectively, and then the other one is the LCU, which is a very conventional, almost World War II generation of landing craft. This thing is called the UHAC, so tell us a little bit about it.
Well, so it consists of a vehicle platform with caterpillar treads like you would see on a tank or on a bulldozer. And then those treads, though, instead of being the little ones that you see on those vehicles today, it's about a 2-foot long foam tread that extends out from the belt in the middle. And what it does is it uses those foam treads to swim through the water, just like a paddle boat might. And then when it hits the ground, it will use those treads to drive on, and can drive for another 15 or 20 miles like that. The other benefit of these big foam treads is that they give you some ballistic protection for the forces that are inside, because bullets and even RPGs aren't going to penetrate that. And then you can add to that some self-defense features to deal with anti-ship cruise missiles. And now that connector actually might be able to defend itself against the kinds of threats that somebody might be willing to launch against it.
And ultimately what you want is you want to be able to put 3 M1 tanks on this,
Right.
land them ashore, and be able to drive them as far as 15 miles inshore.
Right, so you'd be able to put multiple vehicles on it. So you could put 3 M1 tanks on it, but you could also put 4 or 5 of these indirect fires protection capability IFPC missile launchers, which are used for air defense by the Army. Well, you could put several of those on one of these as well, and it can drive about 10 to 15 miles inland and then dump them off on a road somewhere. So now those IFPCs can drive to the location where the Marines are. So it gives you the flexibility to pick your landing location a little bit better than you can with an LCAC, where the LCAC really can't maneuver very much once you get ashore, or an LCU, landing craft utility, because it just goes like World War II, drives on the beach and flops open the door. So you don't have any flexibility with where you land with those two vehicles, but this UHAC would give you that level of flexibility.
One of the things that's actually worth, and yeah, that's better. One of the things that's actually really worth checking out in the report is the fantastic job you do in depicting what China, the capabilities that China and a lot of other countries have in terms of their zones of influence and strike zones and things like that. What I want to ask you about is, if you look at the limitations of U.S. forces to project force, that's one of the things that you guys are seeking to do that. What are some of the layered systems that the United States needs for American forces to be able to reach out and touch someone? Because as you guys note, the Marines have the ability to move troops 300 miles away and deposit them somewhere. The trouble is that those guys are then either vulnerable or can't project force on their own.
Right. So we were able to put Marines on the ground, and they had HIMARS, which they have now a few of, which is a missile launcher that is on the back of a 7-ton truck. You can carry the ATACMs, which the Army has, or their follow-on missile, and those can reach a couple hundred miles away. So they're limited by the INF treaty to 250 miles. But so 250 miles away, if you're able to reach out that far from an expeditionary base that you position closer to the enemy's sea lanes or closer to their territory, now you can actually start threatening the adversary directly in a way that you wouldn't necessarily be able to with ships or aircraft. The problem being that ships or aircraft are pretty easy to find because the background they're operating against is pretty blank, and they have a lot of identifiable signatures. A bunch of guys that are in a ground base, a very small expeditionary base, covered by foliage, hidden by terrain, are probably able to survive a lot longer than those ships or airplanes might. So it creates this problem for the adversary that they've got this threat that can reach a couple hundred miles away, and they've got to figure out a way to root it out. It's the same problem they've been giving us for the last 30 years.
One of the other things that you guys unveiled in this, which was very reassuring, was the idea of a light carrier to take basically the design of the LHA, the America, the aviation ship. The Marine Corps is building only 2 of them. They've decided that all other amphibs will have well decks in them. 2-part question. One, why is it important for the Marine Corps to be building more of those kind of aviation dedicated ships? So 3-part question. Why are those aviation ships important? How many of them do they ultimately need in the force in terms of the big deck force? And you also introduced the idea of converting that into a conventional catapult arresting gear ship. Why is that such an important part of your plan?
Well, so what we envision, though, is that Marines are going to need long-range fires capabilities to protect Marines and to be able to support the operations they're doing and do surface warfare as part of the overall naval force. That drives you to having to have more fixed-wing tactical aircraft inside the Amphibious Ready Group. Today, they're only going to have 6, which means you might have 4 on any given day that are ready to fight, which means I can't really support more than 1 strike operation at a time. Well, if we're doing distributed operations over a wide area, I might have a dozen expeditionary advanced bases being supported by 1 Amphibious Ready Group at any time. So I need more aircraft to be able to do the close air support and the strike missions to support those guys on the ground. To be able to generate that kind of higher number of TAC air, I need to convert my big deck amphibs to carry only TAC air. So we envision doing that today with the existing LHAs and LHDs. So that gives you about 20 tactical aircraft on each of those. And then you'd need to go to a 4-ship ARG so that you can still maintain the rotary wing capacity and the number of well decks you need to be able to do the operations that move the surface connectors out and get the vehicles and stuff that you need ashore for the amphibious ops, and then do the day-to-day things that the Marines do today. what we envision doing then is then transitioning from this LHA, LHD fleet of today, which some of which have well decks, some don't, to only buying the LHA 6 type big deck amphib that has no well deck, but it's the same basic hull design. Then we envision transitioning from that, once a design would be complete, to a regular light carrier that would be about 40,000 tons, so about the same tonnage as the America, but redesigned to support fixed-wing aviation primarily, as opposed to being a hull form designed for a well deck that just doesn't have a well deck.
Which is eminently doable, right? Because if you look at the Essex class,
Right.
the footprint of these ships is incredibly close to what an Essex class ship was. So if you put an angled deck on it, you can sort of, change the island structure, obviously, but you can get there.
Right. So you could build a CVL, a light carrier that would accompany the Amphibious Ready Group. So now you would transition to long-term what we see as a 4-ship ARG with a light carrier, like an Essex class carrier, and then 3 small deck amphibs. And that light carrier is part of the ARG, so it's intended to support marine operations, but it's doing it with fixed-wing aircraft using a catapult launch system. So it would still have some F-35Bs to do kind of STOVL type of distributed operations like the Marines want to do. But it could also carry things like the E-2 Delta and the E-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft. So it's got some other flexibility that you could get by transitioning to that more aviation-centric design.
Any sense, though, whether the Navy would go for that, seeing as how the Navy has put all of its cards into large, big deck, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers?
Well, we see there being a need for both. So what we talk about in here is the fact that the amphibious force needs to have this higher aviation capability to support the operations that it's already planning on doing. So to do the kinds of things that an ARG would do today in 2030, you're going to need a lot more TAC air to support the fire's requirements. So this is simply meeting that requirement. You would still have the need for the kinds of operations that a nuclear carrier would do, which is going to be, maybe twice or 3 times the number of TAC air aircraft that are in that air wing to be able to do large-scale strike operations or large-scale sea control operations that those carriers would do.
But you're talking about this light carrier would be about a $6 billion ship?
Right. Yeah, so we envision it to be about 50% more expensive than the current America-class ships.
One of the other things you guys discussed in the study was going from 27-month deployment cycles for the Marine Amphibious Forces to a 12-month cycle. Why is that change necessary in your view, and what are the benefits that you get from doing it?
So we saw a couple benefits. One is the higher operational tempo you get with the shorter cycle maintains the proficiency of the forces, and that was part of the idea behind our original 4 deployed naval force cycle, which is what the forces in Japan use today. But the problem that those forces have encountered is they haven't been given the time to do the maintenance or the money to do the maintenance they need to do to maintain that level of readiness. So what we attempted to do was to give them more time for maintenance by dialing down their operational time to 50%. Compared to the 67% that they're maintaining today. So that gives them more time in the overall cycle for training and maintenance. We reduced their training requirement by focusing them on a particular region. So instead of the naval forces today having to worry about the entire Pacific Command AOR from Pakistan to Russia, our forces are focused on specific regions like the South China Sea or the East China Sea or the Western Indian Ocean, where they can focus their training on the particular challenges and opportunities of that region, which reduces the amount of the curriculum that they have to conduct in order to be proficient from cycle to cycle.
And one last thing, which is on submarines. Normally, you would expect to see SSGNs, for example, the guided missile submarines. They can carry 154 Tomahawks, would support ground operations. But you guys are looking at a time frame when the attack submarine force is going to be in a trough. Right. And that really does have an effect in the Navy's power projection capabilities, doesn't it?
It does. So in the time frame we're looking at, the 2025, 2030 time frame, we're at sort of the lowest point of the submarine inventory. In addition to that, we envision that pretty much all of our submarine-launched missiles are going to be spoken for operations that the COCOM might need to do for deep inland strikes. So a submarine might be the only way to position a weapons launcher close enough to the adversary's coast to be able to reach a target that's well inside that adversary's territory, which means all those weapons are being used for that as opposed to being available for amphibious operations. So amphibious forces are going to have to do these fires on their own.
Bryan, thanks very, very much. We really appreciate it, and looking forward to the fleet architecture study.
Well, thank you very much, Vago. I appreciate it.